audio. September 2021. This video will serve as an introduction to Sean McMeekin's new revisionist World War II history book, Stalin's War. I have gathered a short list, though by far not exhaustive, of interesting excerpts. However, I recommend those that have an interest in World War II and that time period to read the whole book. The Triumphs of Socialism, page 28. For all the propaganda about building socialism, the truth was that most of Stalin's great new industrial works were modeled on, and in many cases directly imported from, Western capitalist firms, especially American ones. The construction of Stalin's huge iron and steel combines, in theory planned by the State Institute for the Design of Metallurgical Factories, Gazproms, of Leningrad, as Petrograd was renamed in 1924, was overseen by the Frayne Engineering Company of Chicago, Illinois, hired in May 1927. Magnitogorsk was designed from top to bottom by Arthur G. McKee and Company of Cleveland, Ohio, based on the prototype of a U.S. steel plant in Gary, Indiana. In similar fashion, American experts from the McDonald Engineering Company of Chicago had overseen the construction of 4 of the world's largest cement combines, one at Kerch on the Black Sea, 2 outside Moscow, and another just east of the Ural Mountains. The gigantic new hydroelectric plant on the Dnieper River in Ukraine was designed and built by the Hugh L. Cooper firm, based in New York City. Even sensitive Soviet industries such as gold, copper, lead, zinc, and aluminum mining were dependent on American know-how, with 200 American engineers working in Russian non-ferrous metals production by 1933. The main copper smelting plant in the USSR, the Karabakh Combinate in the Urals, employed 11 Yankee engineers. The Soviet bauxite mining and aluminum smelting industry, critical in the construction of tanks and warplanes, was designed from scratch by the American expert Frank E. Dickey, hired from the Alcoa Corporation in 1930, though French aluminum experts were later imported too. Small wonder a Soviet chronicle of the first 5-year plan, Za Industrializatsioy, was forced to admit in 1933, in a passage later purged from official accounts of the period, that it was a combination of American business and science with Bolshevik wisdom that had created these industrial giants in 3 or 4 years. So ubiquitous were American specialists in Stalin's planned economy that they had their own expatriate newspaper, the Moscow News, whose articles and ads targeted American engineers, specialists and miners working in the USSR. Even the ubiquitous emblem of Stalinist central planning, the state-run, mechanized, collective farm or kolkhoz, inspired by Marx's exhortation in the Communist Manifesto to unleash industrial armies in the countryside, was modeled on an American capitalist operation. This was the family farm of one Thomas D. Campbell, the wheat king of Montana, who happened to own a sprawling estate of 95,000 acres, large enough to satisfy Stalin's notion of mechanized gigantism in the countryside. Campbell visited Soviet Russia on Stalin's invitation in both 1928 and 1930 to teach Soviet collectives the latest techniques in mechanized wheat production. Stalin also resolved to model the evolving Red Air Force, Vojenno-Vozdushny Sily or VVS, on American aviation technology. So critical was this priority for Stalin, increasingly referred to simply as the Vozhd, leader, that he dispatched a massive espionage team of 75 students in summer 1931 to enroll in U.S. universities such as MIT and take jobs in aviation firms. The most important of these agents, Stanislav Shumovsky, codenamed Blériot, would remain in the United States for over a decade, overseeing a spying operation so successful that, by the mid-1930s, his men had placed agents or recruited sources in all the main U.S. aviation firms, from the Douglas plant in Southern California, manufacturer of the DC series of huge, dual-engine passenger planes, transports, and bombers, to Bell Aircraft in Buffalo, New York, a leader in fighter design, to Wright Aeronautical in Paterson, New Jersey, the largest manufacturer of aero engines in the entire world. Shumovsky became more brazen the longer he stayed, escorting Andrei Tupolev, Sergei Ilyushin, and Pavel Sukhoi, 3 of Stalin's top military aircraft designers, around several dozen American universities, research labs, and aviation plants, allowing them to reverse engineer American fighters, light bombers, and transport planes into Soviet versions. Coup in Washington, page 32. Despite winning recognition from most European and Asian powers, the USSR's diplomatic position remained precarious in the early 1930s. Some of the countries that had taken the lead in recognizing Moscow later reversed course. The most important diplomatic holdout was the United States. The real issue in 1933 was not breaking the ice, but deciding whether or not to demand a serious quid pro quo in exchange for recognition of Stalin's tyrannical regime and for extending it new loans. All the leverage, In other words, was enjoyed by the United States. The Soviets desired recognition to win international prestige, enhance access to Western capital, and open new embassies and consulates offering legal protections for Soviet agents and communists operating in North America. By contrast, U.S. firms already had access to the Soviet market, limited, but only by the ability of the Soviets to pay. Any new loans to Stalin that the U.S. government would guarantee might stimulate demand for U.S. exports, but they would also come with a substantial risk of default, based on a clear pattern of Soviet behavior dating back to 1918. There were more serious risks too, evident in the record of communist subversion of countries that had allowed Soviet agents to operate out of embassies, such as Germany, Britain, and China. The advantages of recognition were so lopsided in Stalin's favor that Roosevelt could have set terms as steep as he liked, demanding repayment of the entire $600 million in lost principal, along with ironclad guarantees that the Soviet government cease subsidizing the Communist Party of the United States of America, CPUSA, and other agents on U.S. soil. Litvinov came to Washington in November 1933 to plead for recognition, fully expecting that he would have to agree to repay, if not the $500 million he expected Roosevelt to ask for, then at the very least a substantial sum of money. Roosevelt, alas, did not have any idea how much leverage he enjoyed. Remarkably, his opening bid was not $600 million, nor the $500 million Litvinov expected, but $150 million, a mere fourth of the principal owed, and even that, he let Litvinov know, was not so much his own claim but the smallest sum that he could persuade Congress to accept. With the president signaling that he thought $150 million unreasonable, it was an easy trick for Litvinov to barter him down to a non-committal figure between $75 and $150 million. With chutzpah, Litvinov then commissioned a study by the Soviet Ministry of Finance on Tsarist assets seized inside the United States in retaliation for the 1918 default, coughing up the figure of $143 million, which, after being adjusted for interest, allowed Litvinov to issue a counterclaim for $161 million. If accepted, it would nullify FDR's own watered-down claim entirely. To twist the knife in, Stalin invited the New York Times correspondent in Moscow, Walter Duranty, notorious among more honest foreign journalists for his blanket denials of the Ukrainian famine earlier that year, to the Kremlin for a sympathetic Christmas Day interview. With sycophancy impressive even by his own abysmal standards, Duranty neglected to ask a single question about Soviet obligations to deposed American bondholders, instead lofting Stalin's softball such as "What do you think is the potential for Soviet-American trade? And how can you reassure foreign creditors about Soviet means to pay?" Stalin nearly slipped here, admitting that the Soviets had defaulted on German loans, but he claimed that this was not relevant, as we are no longer dependent on German industry, but can manufacture our own equipment now. An intelligent interviewer would have probed here to learn why, if the Soviets really no longer needed foreign imports or technology transfers for Stalin's industrialization drive, they were so keen on securing American recognition and new loans from Wall Street. Instead, Duranty meekly asked, "So, what is your opinion of America?" Reeling in his target with flattery, Stalin replied that the new president was a decisive and masculine leader. By the time Litvinov and Stalin were done manipulating him, Roosevelt had agreed to reduce U.S. claims, after subtracting Soviet claims of compensation for seized Tsarist assets, to a mere $75 million. And even this modest sum, in a trick the Germans were now painfully familiar with, would not be paid off immediately, but rather in a rolling installment plan via excessive interest due on a new $200 million U.S. government-guaranteed loan from the Export-Import Bank to Moscow, payable over 20 or 25 years. Rather than secure relief for American investors and bondholders robbed blind by the Bolsheviks at a time of great economic hardship, Roosevelt had instead promised Stalin a vast store of ready American capital, which would allow him to resume his rearmament drive at full blast. The only demands the president's negotiating team, headed by Henry Morgenthau, levied in exchange for the diplomatic recognition they granted the USSR on November 16, 1933, was this non-binding promise to pay off old debts via a large new loan, a vague understanding that the Soviets used this loan to purchase American products, and a non-binding promise to refrain from interfering in any manner in the internal affairs of the United States. Except for the Soviet promise to buy U.S. wares with export-import credits, that is, to enjoy the privilege of importing desperately needed goods with no cash down, there was never any intention, on Stalin's part, of being true to the letter of Litvinov's carefully worded declarations. Soviet officials haggled for months over repayment terms on American loans, threatening to place orders in Europe instead of the United States if interest rates were not reduced. As late as May 1935, the Soviets were still insisting on easy terms and a 20-year loan, while promising nothing about paying old debts. In the years after Roosevelt recognized the USSR, dozens of Soviet agents and CPUSA members infiltrated the US government, helped along by the vigorous, and almost entirely unvetted, bureaucratic expansion of FDR's New Deal. Key targets for infiltration included the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, where a communist cell run by Harold Weir provided entree for notorious Soviet agents such as Whittaker Chambers, Elizabeth Bentley, and Nathan Silvermaster. Weir, though American-born, had lived in Soviet Russia in the early 1920s, overseeing an experiment in mechanized collectivist agriculture. Russian peasants mostly remembered him chasing them around threateningly with a baseball bat. Communists also infiltrated the Works Progress Administration, the National Labor Relations Board, and the Justice Department. The State Department, meanwhile, was honeycombed with Soviet agents such as Lawrence Duggan, codenamed Frank, Michael Straight, Nigel, and Alger Hiss. The communist penetration of the FDR administration after 1933 was noteworthy, because the public line of the CPUSA was harshly critical of the New Deal, suggesting that it was not enthusiasm for the president's policies that motivated communists to work for him. What drove communist penetration of the US government in the mid-1930s was not ideological affinity, at least until Stalin's doctrinal about-face in 1935, but Soviet opportunism, enabled by the Roosevelt administration's lax security. The most critical factor was the stamp of legitimacy the president had placed on the USSR by recognizing Stalin's regime, which removed the stigma from Communist Party membership. Between recognition, in November 1933, and 1938, the ranks of card-carrying CPUSA members exploded from 13,000 to over 80,000. More important than all these party members put together was the rise of sympathizing agents of influence into the upper reaches of the Roosevelt administration. More highly placed still was Harry Dexter White, a Harvard-educated economist who went to work for the Treasury Department in 1934 and rose rapidly to become the right-hand man of Henry Morgenthau, Roosevelt's powerful Secretary of the Treasury. Venona decrypts show that White began working for the GRU as early as 1935 under the Soviet spy codename Kassir, later changed to jurist, reporting initially to CPUSA members Whittaker Chambers and Nathan Silvermaster, and later directly to Soviet functionaries working for the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, NKVD. By the end of the 1930s, there were hundreds of paid Soviet agents working inside the US government, either 221, according to contemporary Soviet records, or 329, according to the Venona decrypts, from the Departments of Agriculture and State to the Treasury and the US Army. Then there were the 75-plus spies and informants working under Stalin's spy leader, Shomovsky, who stepped up his activities still further after U.S. recognition of the USSR allowed many Soviet nationals to operate perfectly legally under diplomatic cover. Simping for Stalin, page 49. It is worth pausing here to examine the views that cost Bullitt his position as ambassador. Whereas Roosevelt wanted to believe that the shift in Comintern doctrine and the opening of Soviet talks of an anti-German alliance with France signaled a genuine desire on Stalin's part for reconciliation with the capitalist world, Bullitt reported in July 1935, when the Popular Front was being announced, that contrary to the comforting belief which the French now cherish, it is my conviction that there has been no decrease in the determination of the Soviet government to produce world revolution. Bullitt based this conclusion on the fact that every single Soviet and Comintern official he had spoken to had expressed his belief in the necessity of world revolution. For this reason, Stalin's diplomatic overtures toward friendly states such as, in the current instance, France were, in Bullitt's view, a merely tactical policy akin to armistice relations, a temporary ceasefire in the battle between communism and capitalism. As for the prospect of a new European war, Bullitt did not doubt that current Soviet policy was peaceful. But this was only because Stalin had not yet completed his armament drive. It is the primary object of the Soviet Foreign Office, Bullitt concluded, to maintain peace. Until the strength of the Soviet Union has been built up to such a point that it is entirely impregnable to attack and ready, should Stalin so desire, to intervene abroad. Where Ambassador Bullitt had seen deception and guile in Stalin's foreign policy, his successor saw unicorns. In a typical Kremlin encounter in June 1938, Joseph Davis fawned over Stalin with compliments. "You are a greater leader than Catherine the Great, than Peter the Great, a greater leader even than Lenin," informed him that "I know you are a man of peace," and offered to share sensitive intelligence about American naval deployments in the Pacific. Inviting Stalin to intervene in U.S. politics, Davis warned the Vosh that, although Roosevelt was favorably disposed toward him and the Soviet Union more generally, the president was surrounded by reactionary elements in Washington, who would, Davis hoped, be sidelined. Davis took the lead for Stalin, urging the president to clean house in the State Department. Roosevelt had been suspicious of the division of Eastern European affairs ever since its head, Robert F. Kelly, had written long memoranda opposing recognition of the USSR back in 1933. Whereas the Western European division was marked by the dilettantism of America's well-born diplomatic establishment, Kelly's division conducted actual research. Budding Soviet experts such as Loy Henderson, Ray Atherton, Charles Chip Bolin, and George Kennan, all of whom served tours of duty in Moscow, had put together what Henderson proudly called the best Soviet library in the United States. Unhappy with the diligent reporting of these experts on the Moscow show trials and Great Terror, which sat awkwardly with Davis's courtship of Stalin, Roosevelt had his trusted Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles, a school friend who had attended Groton and Harvard with the president, conduct a thorough purge in 1937. The East European Affairs Division was subordinated into the West European Division, and Kelly was shipped off to Turkey. Even the division's library, which contained incomparable material on Soviet history and government, including editions of Pravda and Izvestia going all the way back to the Russian Revolution, was dismantled, an act of virtual book burning that did away with 2 decades' worth of institutional knowledge of Soviet affairs in Washington. Stalin Wants Europe in Flames, page 83, 178, 196. In Molotov's August 19 draft lies a critical clue to Stalin's thinking. Whereas Hitler, with a Polish war on the horizon, wanted as simple and sweeping a non-aggression pact as possible, Stalin wanted to keep his foreign policy options open, by shortening the pact's duration, by a factor of 5, while also demanding a heavy price up front. Far from wishing to forestall a European war between Germany and the Western powers, Stalin's aim was to ensure that it would break out. According to a controversial transcript of Stalin's remarks on this very day, first published in translation in 1939 and later discovered in the Russian archives, the Vosh told Molotov that, if he cut a deal with England and France, Germany will back off and seek a modus vivendi with the Western powers. By contrast, if Molotov accepted Germany's proposal and conclude a non-aggression pact with her, Stalin predicted that Germany will certainly attack Poland, and the intervention of England and France is then unavoidable. From the communist perspective, the latter scenario, a bloody war in which the capitalist power blocs sought to destroy each other, was much better than peace. It was, Stalin explained, in the interests of the USSR, the land of the toilers, that war breaks out between the Reich and the capitalist Anglo-French bloc. The only danger was that one bloc might defeat the other too quickly, before they had bled each other sufficiently. Everything should be done, Stalin continued, so that the war drags out as long as possible with the goal of weakening both sides. Viewing the Western capitalist powers, led by arch-imperialist Britain, as the stronger side, Stalin argued that the task of Soviet foreign policy, for now, consists in helping Germany, that is, signing a pact with Berlin. With the Japanese conflict in the Far East still unsettled, the USSR should strive to stay out of the European war for as long as possible, while being able to hope for our own timely entrance into war. With Molotov having given the green light for Ribbentrop to come to Moscow, all that remained to work out was the timing. True to Molotov's formula, a German-Soviet economic agreement was inked first, at 2 a.m. on Sunday, August 20, under which the Soviets would supply Hitler with at least 240 million Reichsmarks worth of raw materials over the next 2 years, mostly oil, cotton, manganese, and rubber, in exchange for an equivalent value in German manufactures and technology transfer. This sum was a mere baseline. The goal was to ramp up bilateral trade to 1 billion Reichsmarks per year. Sunday afternoon, Hitler requested that Ribbentrop be received in Moscow on either Tuesday or the following day. In a wire to the Chancellor of the German Reich sent Monday evening, Stalin welcomed the assent of the German government to the conclusion of a non-aggression pact. Despite ultimately agreeing to Soviet territorial demands in Romania, Hitler and Ribbentrop had clearly done so under duress. In strategic terms, Stalin had Hitler over a barrel. Not only was the German war machine dependent on the flow of Russian petroleum from Baku, but this oil was being sent across the Black Sea from Batumi to Odessa and then transshipped into Central Europe via Romania. All this Russian oil, along with Romanian petrol refined at Ploiești, would now have to transit Soviet-controlled territory to reach the German Reich. So dependent was the German war effort on the petroleum supply route through former Galicia that German diplomats insisted the Soviets leave the critical stretch of the double-tracked railway running from Odessa through Cernăuți, Chernovitsa/Chernivtsi, to Krakow on the European standard gauge, even while Soviet sappers converted other lines in eastern Poland to the wider Russian gauge. By opening up the resources of the east to Berlin, the Moscow Pact had enabled Hitler to circumvent the British blockade, which had ultimately doomed Germany in the last war, at the price of turning Germany into an economic vassal of the Soviet Union. So long as Britain stayed in the war, It seemed that Hitler had to swallow his pride and smile through his teeth, despite Stalin's increasingly onerous demands. It was not that the Führer wanted to continue the war with the British Empire. As Hitler remarked upon learning that France had sued for peace on June 17, "The war in the West is over. France is defeated, and I will shortly come to an agreement with England." German peace offers were extended to London via intermediaries in the Vatican, Stockholm, and even the US Embassy in Berlin. It was Churchill's principled refusal to parley, not Hitler's hubris, that ensured the European war would continue. As a frustrated Hitler confessed to Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, in Berchtesgaden on July 13, Britain was unwilling to seriously discuss peace terms because Churchill was placing her hopes in Russia and the United States. Neither of those continent-sized powers were in the war yet, but Churchill was convinced that they would join him against Hitler eventually. Compounding Hitler's frustration, Stalin, though cold-shouldering Churchill and Ambassador Cripps, maintained the pretense of neutrality in the World War, even while happily pocketing territory in the slipstream of Hitler's military victories. Molotov might hint at dissatisfaction at being excluded from the Tripartite Pact, but then Stalin had adamantly refused to declare war on Britain. German diplomats stressed their cooperation with Russia. Russian diplomats played this down at every turn. Soviet duplicity was mind-boggling. Suvorov Hypothesis, page 228, 278, 290. The Soviet mobilization plan was honed further in talks between Timoshenko, Stalin, and the Chief of the General Staff, Kirill Meretskov, held in the Kremlin from October 3 to 5, 1940. In addition to reaffirming that the main grouping would occur on the Southwestern Front, the October 5 Soviet mobilization plan assumed, for the first time, that the Red Army would ultimately take the offensive against Germany and its allies. The goal was to concentrate sufficient armor on the Southwestern Front, 80 infantry, 11 tank and 5 motorized divisions, plus 20 special tank brigades and 140 aviation regiments, to make possible a powerful strike in the direction of Lublin, with the objective of cutting Germany off from Romania and the Balkans. Of course, to launch such a massive mechanized force onto enemy territory would require a huge investment in logistics and infrastructure in western Ukraine. To this end, Timoshenko and Meretskov asked that Stalin appropriate whatever funds were necessary to develop the rail network and build aerodromes on the western and southwestern fronts, the latter expected shortly to house 20,000 warplanes. Overall, the new mobilization plan demanded that the Soviet Air Force aim for a balance of 60% bombers and 40% fighters for 1941, with all of them to be used in the West. In mid-December 1940, after Stalin's demands were rejected and German countermoves had begun in Romania and Bulgaria, the Balkan situation was threatening enough that Stalin ordered a detailed plan for Southwestern Front deployment from the commander of the Kiev Military District, General M. A. Perkev. Perkev's report outlined his district's available force pool and armor: 20 infantry and 5 mechanized corps, including 11 tank and 5 motorized divisions, 13 special tank and 7 motorized brigades, 81 aviation regiments, and 2 airborne assault brigades, measured the carrying capacity of the railroads running west toward the frontier, summarized the state of aerodrome construction in western Ukraine, Bessarabia, and northern Bukovina, and proposed a mobilization timetable for each echelon of the force that would invade Romania and the Reich, including how long it would take them to reach the enemy border. The most dramatic material evidence of more offensive Soviet intent was the construction of forward air bases abutting the new frontier separating Stalin's empire from Hitler's. The main Soviet administration of aerodrome construction, run by the NKVD, ordered the construction of 251 new Red Air Force bases in 1941, of which fully 80%, 199, were located in western districts abutting the German Reich, and not just any districts either. They were built in territories Stalin had acquired since the Moscow Pact, including 61 in western Belorussia, the northern sector of occupied Poland, 54 in western Ukraine, the southern sector of occupied Poland, 5 in Soviet Moldavia, occupied Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, 11 in Sovietized Latvia, 7 in Lithuania, 5 in Estonia, 4 on the Karelian Isthmus of occupied Finland, and 4 in the Soviet border district abutting East Prussian Königsberg. There were also 18 new aerodromes being built in the military districts of Kiev and Odessa, essential to operations on the southwestern front, including surveillance and bombing runs into Romania, but recessed further from the enemy frontier than the other aerodromes. The cost of each of these new Soviet air bases, even with the use of NKVD slave labor, averaged 16 to 17 million rubles. Stalin thus spent 3.3 billion rubles in 1941 building air bases within a half-hour's flying distance of Hitler's Reich. Whatever else may be said about this, it was clearly an extraordinary and high-risk strategic investment. The most interesting aspect of the new Soviet deployment pattern lay in its lopsided emphasis on the southwestern front, facing Galicia and Romania. To be sure, Hitler had never made a secret of his interest in the economic resources of Ukraine, a theme he first sounded in Mein Kampf in 1925. The Führer's fixation on Ukraine would have been an argument in favor of Stalin devoting significant military resources there. But the Soviet deployment pattern in Ukraine in 1940-1941 was not defensive. There was no Maginot Line going up south of the Pripyat marshes. Unlike in the years before 1914, when the Tsarist government had disappointed Russia's French ally by refusing to invest in new rail lines in the west for fear they would be used by the Germans, this time the Russians were building as many roads and rail lines as Berie's NKVD slave conscripts could manage, along with tank parks and petrol stations. Even the last line of Russia's logistical defense, the wider rail gauge of 1,524 mm, 5 feet, incompatible with the European standard of 1,435 mm, 4 feet, 81/2 inches, was being eroded in the borderlands, with Soviet engineers re-gauging 7,500 kilometers of the railway network to facilitate movement westward. It is true that there were still defensive fortifications left in place from the Stalin Line built behind the old frontier between 1926 and 1937, mostly concrete pillboxes housing machine guns. Roughly 200 to 250 kilometers, about 140 to 180 miles, west of the Stalin Line, in territories occupied since 1939, construction of pillboxes had begun in June 1940, but coverage was thin. Border troops referred to the half-hearted defensive system derisively as the Molotov Line. Rather than fortification to slow down an advancing army, far more Soviet resources were devoted to building infrastructure to speed an army's movement. Since the dissident Soviet historian Vladimir Reason, pen name Viktor Suvorov, first proposed in his best-selling Icebreaker, 1990, that Stalin was planning an offensive war against Germany in 1941, scores of Russian historians have investigated the Suvorov thesis and turned up thousands of intriguing documents. In the late 1990s, two thick volumes of these documents, drawn from a half-dozen Russian archives, including hypersensitive military archives that no longer grant free access to this material, were published in Moscow as the year 1941. Russian historians, many of whom now write under pseudonyms to avoid government scrutiny, continue to probe the secrets of the Soviet military posture in June 1941. But considerable mystery remains surrounding Stalin's intentions on the eve of war. In the thaw of the late Perestroika years, Izvestia published a logbook showing that Stalin hosted his military chiefs on May 24, 1941, including Timoshenko, Zhukov, head of the Red Army Operations Department N.F. Vatutin, and head of the Red Army Air Force Pavel Vigorev, in the Kremlin. In his 2000 study Stalin's Missed Opportunity, Mikhail Meltyukov surmises that a decision was made at this conference regarding the completion of Soviet military preparations. And yet neither Meltyukov nor his scholarly heir Mark Solonin has unearthed a transcript of this meeting. None of the principals left behind an account in diaries or memoirs. The same is the case for shorter meetings between Stalin and his military chiefs held on June 3, 6, 7, and 9, 1941. We know the names of those the Vazht met, including Timoshenko, Zhukov, Vatutin, and Voroshilov, but not what they discussed. Nor is there mention of these meetings in the Politburo special files declassified in the late Yeltsin years. What these special files do reveal, if not a smoking gun about Stalin's offensive intentions vis-à-vis Hitler, is a positively breathtaking ramp-up in Soviet military preparations from April to June 1941. Any lingering notion, which one still sometimes encounters in general histories of the Second World War, that Stalin and his generals were asleep at the wheel as Hitler's generals prepared for Barbarossa, must now be dismissed as absurd. We can glean an idea of the scale of Soviet military preparations, and their potentially offensive character, from Politburo Resolution No. 171 of March 24, 1941, which assigned the construction of 251 new Soviet military aerodromes bordering the German Reich to the NKVD and assigned 400,000 slave laborers for the task, of which the NKVD was authorized, beginning in April, to source 25,000 from NKVD road-building labor battalions in European Russia. The new NKVD Aerodrome Agency was also allowed to conscript 2,300 engineering students. On May 5, 1941, the day Stalin renounced defensive doctrine in his speech to the military academy graduates, the Politburo authorized the NKVD to draft another 100,000 laborers for its aerodrome construction battalions, from birth years 1913 to 1921, who were not already conscripted into the Red Army. Urgent Politburo resolutions were passed every day in spring 1941 related to weapons procurement, T-34 and KV tanks, anti-tank guns, MiG fighters and light bombers, weapon systems and ammunition, the construction of tank parks and petrol depots near the German frontier, and on and on. Still, the abundant archival evidence we now have of aggressive Soviet military preparations prior to June 22, 1941, does not by any means suggest that Hitler conceived of Barbarossa as a Provenekrieg, preemptive or preventive war. By 1941, so little trust was left in the Devil's Bargain signed in Moscow in August 1939 that an armed clash was almost bound to ensue, whoever initiated hostilities. Much would be determined by who would strike first, gaining control of enemy airspace and knocking out airfields and tank parks. Soviet commanders, no less than their German counterparts, had been drilled in the importance of nesubnost, suddenness, and the element of surprise. The Red Army had struck first in Finland in November 1939, had crushed the Baltic states in less than 3 days in June 1940, and had swept into Bessarabia before the Romanian army could react. After Stalin's May 5 speech, party propagandists were ordered to step up the Bolshevik indoctrination of the personnel of the Red Army and of the whole Soviet people in the spirit of burning patriotism, revolutionary decisiveness, and constant readiness to go over to a crushing offensive against the enemy. The problem Stalin and his army chiefs faced in June 1941 was that the Germans were simply far better at offensive planning and logistics. There was a sense of creeping horror as it dawned on the Soviet high command that the Germans had the jump on them. There was truth in Stalin's candid self-reproach, for his own mistakes had contributed greatly to the crushing early gains of Germany and its allies. It was Stalin, along with his not quite equal partner Molotov, who, by signing the Moscow Pact in August 1939, had erased the series of buffer states lying between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, rendering useless the defensive fortifications of the Stalin Line. It was Stalin who had prioritized the procurement of light bombers and medium and heavy tanks, rather than more maneuverable fighters, anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns, small arms, and defensive fortifications. It was Stalin who had overseen the massive investment in airfields, tank parks, petrol stations, and road building in newly occupied frontier districts abutting the Reich. It was Stalin who had invaded 6 western neighbors between 1939 and 1941, alarming the Germans and other neighbors who were afraid of being devoured next. The Soviet invasions of Finland and Romania had backfired spectacularly, as these countries were now fighting alongside the German Wehrmacht to redeem their honor and regain their lost territory. Most of all, Stalin's attempt to blackmail Hitler during and after the Berlin Summit of November 1940 had boomeranged in his face. After cheaply pocketing huge gains in the slipstream of German battlefield victories like a jumped-up Mussolini, Stalin had tried to bully Hitler into submission, using his economic leverage as a battering ram. The final straw, from the German perspective, had come when Stalin had endorsed the US-British-backed coup in Belgrade and signed a defensive alliance with Yugoslavia's new anti-German government. Stalin's actions since August 1939 had removed all effective barriers to German invasion while furnishing Hitler and Germany's allies with a half-dozen plausible casus belli for war. With red flags being waved everywhere from the Arctic Circle to the Bosporus, it is not surprising the Soviet bull was gored. Roping America into a war, page 377. Still, Stalin was not satisfied. Confirming that the Soviet Manchurian front would be inactive for the rest of 1941 allowed the Vosh to strip his far eastern defenses to reinforce Moscow. But would it not be still better to push Japan over the edge into war with the United States, to ensure the safety of Siberia for the following year and years to come? As Ambassador Bullitt had tried to warn Roosevelt in 1935, it was the hardiest hope of the Soviet government that the United States will become involved in a war with Japan. Had provoking such a conflict not been Stalin's intention after all, had the Vosh cared a whit for collective security or the welfare of his accidental allies, he could have shared Sorge's intelligence coups about Japanese troop movements in the Pacific with Churchill or Roosevelt. He did no such thing. Stalin could also have requested that Sorge use his contacts in the Japanese government to advise Konoe to back down. Instead, Sorge had these contacts tell the Prime Minister that Japan was much better off going to war with the United States and Britain than doing anything that might disturb the Soviet Union. With the Battle of Moscow raging, the last thing Stalin wanted was for Tokyo and Washington to bury the hatchet. In the cabinet on November 7, Roosevelt declared that he intended to strain every nerve to satisfy and keep on good relations with Japanese diplomats. "Let us make no move of ill will," the President instructed Secretary of State Cordell Hull. "Let us do nothing to precipitate a crisis." When he got wind that a modus vivendi between Tokyo and Washington might be in sight, Stalin's man at the Treasury, Harry Dexter White, was apoplectic. White promptly wrote up a memorandum to Roosevelt in Morgenthau's name, warning him that acceding to a Far Eastern Munich would sell China to her enemies for 30 blood-stained coins of gold. To ensure that no Munich would be possible, White composed a list of 10 demands to be presented to Japan, which bore an uncanny resemblance to those his NKVD handler Pavlov had asked him to memorize back in May 1941. Typed up by White on June 6, 1941, the Soviet Pavlov version had demanded that Japan withdraw all military, naval, air police forces from China, boundaries as of 1931, from Indochina and from Thailand. In White's November draft, which was handed over by the Secretary of State to Kurisu and the Japanese ambassador on November 26, known to history as the Hull Note, the wording was almost identical, excepting that Thailand was dropped, ostensibly because Japan had still not occupied that country. Japan will withdraw all military, naval, air and police forces from China and from Indochina. Whether or not White's November 26 draft was intended as an ultimatum, this is certainly how the Hull Note was interpreted in Tokyo. On December 1, Emperor Hirohito met with Tojo's cabinet. It is now clear, Tojo stated, that Japan's claims cannot be attained through diplomatic means. The cabinet agreed, voting unanimously for war. 1 week later, Japanese dive bombers launched a furious assault on the U.S. fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor on Oahu, Hawaii, along with nearby airfields. Although the Pearl Harbor attack garnered the most headlines, Japanese raids were carried out simultaneously in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia, plunging the British Empire into the Pacific War, along with attacks on Thailand, the U.S. territories of the Philippines and Guam, and even the international settlement in Shanghai. In this way, Stalin's goal in negotiating his neutrality pact with Tokyo in April, to embroil Britain and the United States in war with Japan, was achieved. Siberia was safe, the reinforcement of Moscow could continue. Of course, Stalin was supposedly now allied to the very powers he had encouraged Japan to annihilate, powers now supplying his armies with vast quantities of war material. But so long as they did not make reciprocal demands of Moscow, such as asking for help against Japan, this was not Stalin's problem. Abusing Lend-Lease, page 389, 396. Roosevelt's decision to devote scarce tonnage and naval resources to Soviet Lend-Lease supplies was a priceless gift to Stalin. In exchange for opening up this vital lifeline for the beleaguered Soviet war effort, the U.S. government could have asked any price: payment in cash, by loan or in kind, political concessions inside Russia, or promises from Stalin of better behavior abroad, such as abandoning his spying operations in Washington or offering token support for the U.S.-British war against Japan. Instead, the Americans simply gave and demanded nothing in return aside from a vague, non-binding promise of loan repayment beginning 5 years after the war was over, at no interest. Remarkably, Lukashev's Soviet purchasing agents were also allowed to inspect whatever American factories they wished to, invited, in effect, to commit industrial espionage. It was not an accident that his two most important aviation experts were Stanislav Shamovsky, code-name Bleriot, and Pyotr Bayaev, code-name Mikhailov, sleeper agents Stalin had placed in the United States back in 1931. Spying was superfluous in the Lend-Lease era, as Shamovsky and Bayaev no longer had to copy files and recruit informants. They could now tell Stalin what to order directly from the best U.S. aviation factories, Bell, Douglas, and Curtiss-Wright. Indeed, the Soviet cause enjoyed such huge popularity in Washington by the end of 1941, as Gromyko informed Molotov, that Soviet assets in the U.S. government, like Harry Dexter White, no longer felt the need to lay low and wait for instructions from their handlers. White could walk over to the Soviet embassy and casually suggest reorienting the U.S. machine tool industry to meet Stalin's needs, as White promised Gromyko he would do on December 24, 1941. Nor did Soviet purchasing agents have to pay in cash for planes, specialized machine tools, or prototypes, as they had done in the 1930s. Everything would be delivered to the USSR, essentially free of charge. That Soviet industrial espionage in the United States during the war took place on a massive scale is confirmed in the files of the Lend-Lease administration and the State Department. Lukashev's men did this dozens of times in 1942 alone, touring, for example, the Homestead Steel Plant in Marshall, Pennsylvania, the National Tube Works in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, and the Gary Steel Works in Indiana. Lukashev's agents were regular visitors at the main U.S. tank testing facility in Aberdeen, Maryland, where Soviet officers were allowed to inspect M3 series Stuart tanks as they were put through their paces. Reciprocity was non-existent. The former U.S. military attaché in Moscow, Cayton, had frequently requested access to Soviet facilities, only to be denied. That this industrial espionage was conducted at the behest of Soviet authorities at the highest level is confirmed in the Molotov papers at the Communist Party archives. On December 1, 1941, Vyacheslav Malishev, vice chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, and also, from October 1940, Commissar of Heavy Machine Building and, from September 1941, Commissar of the Soviet tank industry, wrote Molotov that it would be extremely desirable to become acquainted with and to study in greater detail the processes and phenomena currently used in industrial factories in America. Malishev instructed Molotov to send to Washington a team of 15 to 20 experts, with representatives from the commissariats of tank, ship, heavy machine building, armaments, aviation, metallurgy, and electricity, to study the technology and organization of mass production of tanks, warplanes, and ammunition, in particular learning what is new and different in American methods, compared to the principles known to us of auto-tractor technology. With these words, the man in charge of all Soviet tank production from 1941 to 1945 gave the lie to the Soviet claim of disinterest in American tank technology because of the T-34 breakthrough, and even the T-34 used the suspension design of the American engineer J. Walter Christie. As to aviation, Stalin's keen interest in American technology, never well hidden, was now an openly acknowledged secret, registered with every new requisition his spies made. Far from slowing down after Pearl Harbor, Soviet orders only grew more ambitious. On December 30th and 31st, 1941, Lukasev placed two orders, the first for 8.5 million high-chrome stainless steel ball bearings to be delivered in 1942, and the second for monthly shipments of 6 million pounds of solventless nitroglycerin powder, for use in Red Army flamethrowers. As Lukasev knew perfectly well, the U.S. Army, in the wake of Pearl Harbor, was trying to ramp up production of military vehicles, which placed huge strain on chrome supplies. Current demands for bearings resulting from our own expanding aircraft and tank programs, Stettinius was informed by U.S. Army engineers, have critically affected our supply. I am sure you understand the difficulties. Because stainless steel balls have been denied our own military forces, W. L. Batt wrote to Stettinius on behalf of the Army, we therefore ask that the USSR give consideration to accepting corrosion-resistant plating rather than high chrome steel balls. Hopkins was having none of this. Instead of disappointing Stalin, he would disappoint the U.S. Army brass, approving, on March 19, 1942, a shipment of 2.5 million high-chrome stainless steel balls to the Red Army, a volume large enough to produce serious shortages in the first year the United States fought in the war. The Soviet observers, White continued, did not hesitate to pull out rulers and measure sizes of gun mountings and any equipment that caught their eye. It was necessary to request that one member of the party not measure the gun ports on a B-17. One Russian was even observed pulling the zipper on the covering which concealed confidential automatic flight control engineer, AFCE, equipment installed in the plane. In this way, Stalin's purchasing agents obtained intelligence on the state-of-the-art U.S. Norden bombsight targeting system, the most closely guarded secret in the American arsenal, by invitation, in broad daylight. The case of the Norden bombsight provides a fascinating illustration of the double standard of the Roosevelt administration. For all the vaunted partnership between Roosevelt and Churchill, the United States shared this sensitive technology with the RAF only after being granted reciprocal access to the secret of British sonar tracking of submarines. In the same fashion, every single Lend-Lease item Britain imported from the United States had to be paid for in full, and it was all paid. By contrast, Stalin paid nothing for Lend-Lease goods, aside from a few token shipments of gold bullion sent to the United States as a goodwill gesture in early 1942. Shipments that were cut off after the HMS Edinburgh, carrying 465 gold bars, was sunk by the Germans in the Arctic on May 2, 1942. Lenin had once prophesied that, after the revolution, capitalists would be happy to sell communists the rope they would use to hang them. And yet not even Lenin could have imagined that American capitalists would hand over the rope free of charge. Covering up the Cayton massacre, page 443. Tensions over the Polish question were thus already running high when, in early 1943, the first fragmentary evidence of Stalin's mass murder of Polish officers and elites at Cayton was uncovered. The grisly sight was worth the wait. By early April 1943, Boots and his workers had uncovered 11 mass graves. The largest pit contained 12 layers of neatly stacked corpses, each layer containing some 250 bodies. This ghastly grave thus contained nearly 3,000 corpses. Sensing a brilliant coup, Hitler's propaganda chief, Goebbels, invited Polish leaders to the gravesite to verify the discovery. On April 13, 1943, Radio Berlin announced its bombshell. The Germans had discovered mass graves containing the bodies of thousands of officers of the former Polish army, interned in the USSR in 1939 and bestially murdered by the Bolsheviks during the Soviet occupation in 1940. 2 days later, Radio Moscow issued a rebuttal, claiming that the Polish officers had been murdered by German fascist hangmen in the summer of 1941. At 4:30 p.m. on April 17, representatives of the Polish exile government in London filed a request in Geneva for an investigation by the International Red Cross, only to discover that the Germans had just filed a similar motion. Red Cross executives, not wishing to appear partial, agreed only on the condition that all three interested parties, Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union, approved. Tellingly, Moscow denounced requests for a Red Cross investigation as villainous tricks. To any impartial observer, this suggested strongly that, however horrendous the war crimes committed so far by the Germans might have been, in this case it was Stalin who was guilty. For Stalin's Western allies to conclude this, however, would be awkward. To entertain the possibility that Stalin was guilty of the Cayton massacre would remind everyone that he had been Hitler's partner in invading Poland and call into question the purpose of the War of 1939, a war ostensibly launched by Britain and France to liberate Poland from foreign subjugation. It would make a mockery of the Atlantic Charter and every speech Roosevelt and Churchill had given about the values they were fighting for. Moreover, it might raise awkward questions about the decisions Roosevelt and Churchill had made to lavish Stalin with Lend-Lease aid and arms, questions their domestic critics had sensibly raised back in 1941, only to be silenced. To make sure no such questions were asked, Stalin went on the offensive immediately, smearing Sikorsky and the Polish exile government, along with the International Red Cross, as Hitlerite lackeys and, in a brutal headline in Pravda on April 19, 1943, the helpmates of cannibal Hitler. It was a moment of truth for Churchill and Roosevelt. Would these signatories of the Atlantic Charter swallow Stalin's slanders against the International Red Cross and the Polish government, on whose behalf the war had been fought in the first place? The answer was yes. Churchill, who replied first, reassured Stalin on April 24 that Britain would oppose vigorously any investigation by the International Red Cross or any other body in any territory under German authority, and promised to send his foreign minister to meet with Sikorsky and press him as strongly as possible to withdraw all countenance from any investigation under Nazi auspices. In a follow-up telegram sent on April 25, Churchill did remind Stalin, delicately, that Sikorsky had several times raised this question of the missing officers with the Soviet government, and once with you personally, suggesting that he suspected Stalin knew more than he was letting on. But Churchill then forfeited any possible leverage on the matter when he promised Stalin that he would lean on Sikorsky to restrain Polish press from polemics. Roosevelt, in his reply to Stalin, declared that Sikorsky had made a mistake in asking for a Red Cross investigation, and that he was confident Churchill would find a way to set the London Poles straight, so they would act in the future with more common sense. Roosevelt did express hope that Stalin would order a mere suspension of conversations with the Polish government in exile rather than a complete severance of relations, but this was only a suggestion. The president even promised Stalin that he would try to help him in any way with his Polish problem, for example, by looking after any Poles which he may desire to send out of the Soviet Union. Stalin politely declined the president's bizarre offer to cleanse the USSR of unwanted Poles, assuring Roosevelt, with a wink, that he viewed any and all Poles residing on Soviet soil as his close personal friends and comrades, of whom there was no question of their being deported from the Soviet Union. Encouraged by the obsequious response from his allies, the Vosh broke off relations with Sikorsky's government. In a letter to Sikorsky's liaison diplomat in Moscow on April 25, nearly as brutal as the ultimatum he had served the Polish ambassador prior to the Soviet invasion in September 1939, Molotov faulted Sikorsky for failing to offer a rebuff to the vile fascist calumny that the Soviet government had murdered the Polish officers. The Soviet government are aware, Molotov continued, that this hostile campaign against the Soviet Union has been undertaken by the Polish government in order to exert pressure for the purpose of wresting from them territorial concessions at the expense of the interests of Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Belorussia, and Soviet Lithuania. In this way, Stalin and Molotov misdirected their own guilt by slander, and ascribed to the Polish exile government the very imperialistic motives they had used to dismember Poland. Here was Soviet diplomatic cynicism raised to an art form. Far from objecting to this bullying, Stalin's Western allies fell quickly into line. In his telegram to Stalin on April 25, Churchill reassured the Soviet dictator that he was examining the possibility of silencing those Polish papers in this country which attacked the Soviet government. As early as April 23, the head of the U.S. Office of War Information, Elmer Davis, based on no evidence whatsoever, broadcast a report about Cayton endorsing Stalin's claim that the mass graves represented a Nazi and not a Soviet crime, a position that would remain the official line of the U.S. government until 1951. In supporting the Soviet line on Cayton and suppressing further investigation or discussion, Churchill and Roosevelt had adopted an attitude of willful blindness toward Stalin's crimes. Abandoning allies, Yugoslavia, Poland, China, page 474, 508, 653. As the highest-ranking officer in the country, Mihailovich was the legatee of the pro-Allied Simovic government that repudiated the Tripartite Pact during the March 1941 coup. Once Mihailovich opened a line of communication with British Cairo, via Malta, in fall 1941, he was recognized by the London exile government and given the rank of Chief of Staff of the Supreme Command. In effect, this set up a kind of proxy war between the royalist Chetniks, ostensibly sponsored by Britain, and Tito's communists, answering to Stalin and the USSR. In a pattern soon familiar in enemy-occupied countries where the claim to leadership of the resistance was contested between pro-Western and pro-Soviet factions, Britain made aid to its own client conditional on collaborating with Stalin's. While a trickle of British supplies was airlifted into Yugoslavia in 1942, it was not enough to support an active military campaign. In the entire 18-month period when they were sponsored by Britain, Mihailovich's Chetniks received only 242 tons of war materiel, scarcely enough to supply a company. And even those few tons that arrived came with strings attached, as each British liaison officer insisted that Mihailovich collaborate with the pro-Soviet partisans. In July 1942, the Special Operations Executive's Cairo office, known in British intelligence shorthand as MO4, appointed a Yugoslav communist, known under the alias Charles Robertson, to Mihailovich's headquarters. Robertson took charge of the radio link with Cairo and launched a smear campaign against Mihailovich. Receiving his slanted reports in Cairo was a highly placed Soviet asset, one of the Cambridge Five, James Klugeman, who worked for MO4. After the war, Klugeman was recorded by MI5 boasting about how he ruined Mihailovich's reputation in Cairo by doctoring maps to attribute to Tito partisans victories actually won by the Chetniks and blasting around Tito's charges that Mihailovich was collaborating with the Nazis, charges originating in Moscow with Dimitrov at Comintern headquarters and spread by Soviet propaganda organs in the West. Equally damaging to Mihailovich's reputation with the British was the activity of another Cambridge spy recruited by Stalin's agents in the 1930s, Guy Burgess, who promoted the cult of Marshal Tito in BBC radio broadcasts to Yugoslavia. Burgess's slanted, increasingly pro-Tito broadcasts were devastating to Chetnik morale. As Mihailovich complained to Colonel Bill Bailey, the head of the 8th British Expeditionary Mission, sent to him in December 1942, the BBC with revolting cynicism dropped its support of the sacred Serbian cause, and functions now publicizing a band of terrorists because the latter provide cheap, sensational and apparently false news. When Bailey forwarded Mihailovich's complaints to BBC headquarters, the justification offered was that English values required even-handedness. Yet as one of the few BBC employees clued into totalitarian agitprop, a certain Miss Baker, wrote the Foreign Office, the Soviets have no such scruples. Not only do they ignore Mihailovich, the Yugoslav government's representative with whom they are supposed to be in alliance and whom they know we support, but in their endeavor to build up the partisans they openly attack him, call him a traitor and demand his extermination. We, on the other hand, have not only refrained from attacking Mihailovich's opponents, but in the last few months we have actually boosted them. The impression it has made on Mihailovich has been disastrous. Making these new British instructions telling Mihailovich to stand down still stranger, they were given just as the Chetniks were fighting for their lives against German troops in western Serbia, and winning. Another Chetnik triumph, the detonation on September 30, 1943, of a critical junction on the Belgrade-Salonika railway used by the Wehrmacht, which put the line out of action for nearly 10 days, was falsely credited to the partisans on a BBC broadcast beamed into Yugoslavia. Making this British betrayal still more painful, the highest-level British military mission to Yugoslavia to date now arrived, at Tito's headquarters in Jajce, central Bosnia. Fitzroy McLean, the ex-diplomat, Soviet expert, and member of the House of Commons, answered directly to Churchill, who gave him the rank of brigadier. Whereas the Hudson and Bailey missions to Mihailovich had been set up to fail, McLean's mission was designed to succeed. The report McLean submitted in October 1943 was based on what Tito had told him about partisan exploits, not anything McLean had witnessed. The same was true of McLean's claims disparaging the Chetniks, in which he simply repeated slanders Tito fed to him. Judging by material commitment, Churchill had already made up his mind on Yugoslavia long before McLean killed off Mihailovich's chances for good. There was a brutal irony in McLean's claim that Mihailovich was not doing enough to tackle Germans with arms Britain was not sending him. In the 3 months after Churchill sent in McLean in mid-September 1943, the partisans received 4,222 tons of war materiel, almost 20 times as much as Mihailovich had received in the 18 months when Britain had supported him, and Mihailovich was now cut off for good. In the first 9 months of 1944, the partisans would receive 22,584 tons of war supplies from the British, 100 times more than the Chetniks had been given. Tito and Stalin could hardly believe their luck. At a time when the Red Army, still lumbering its bloody way forward 1,000 kilometers from the old Soviet border, was unable to get arms to the partisans in Yugoslavia, Churchill had decided to do Stalin's work for him. The timing of Churchill's embrace of the partisans could not have been better for Tito. Nor could it have come at a worse time for Mihailovich and the Chetniks, who now found themselves isolated, their prestige and ability to arm and equip their men so shattered by the British about-face that finding new recruits would be next to impossible. The communist smear of the Chetniks for collaboration, long asserted in Soviet radio broadcasts from the Caucasus and implied in slanted BBC broadcasts, had now been endorsed by McLean in his blockbuster report, receiving the imprimatur of the British government. The British Eliasson, officer, now with the partisan forces, Colonel Bailey reported from Mihailovich's headquarters, for reasons best known to himself, has accepted these imputations at their face value, and passed them on to his superiors. I refrain from commenting on the professional propriety of McLean's behavior with the partisans. It would be a miracle if the Chetniks could survive the coming winter. Rubbing still more salt in Mihailovich's wounds, Time magazine, having already lionized Stalin as Man of the Year, put Marshal Tito on its cover as a Hero of the Week. 22 The stage was set for the Allies' official embrace of Stalin's Yugoslav client at Tehran. During the break before the evening session, Roosevelt invited the Vazd into his chambers for another one-on-one. If we did not have a stenographic transcript of the conversation that followed, witnessed by both Harriman and Bolin, it could scarcely be believed. But the president really did tell Stalin that he would go along with Soviet plans to annex eastern Poland, so long as Stalin understood that there were 6 or 7 million Americans of Polish extraction and that, as a practical man, he did not wish to lose their votes. For this reason, he could not take any part publicly in any such arrangement at the present time, but Roosevelt promised that would have a free hand after the 1944 elections. As for Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, Roosevelt jokingly assured Stalin that when the Soviet armies reoccupied these areas, he did not intend to go to war with the Soviet Union as long as the principle of self-determination was vaguely respected, in order to appease American voters of Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian origin. The president added that he was confident the Baltic peoples, if asked, would vote to join the Soviet Union. Even this obsequious comment was not enough for Stalin, who objected that the Baltic states had belonged to Tsarist Russia. No one had raised the question of public opinion then, and he did not quite see why it was being raised now. Nevertheless, the Vazd agreed to arrange an expression of the will of the people in accordance with the Soviet constitution in the Baltic states, that is, without international observers present if it would make the president happy. Roosevelt agreed. During the final plenary session on December 1, there was a moment of tension when Stalin, to forestall any effort by Churchill to pull back Roosevelt's promises regarding Poland, slandered the Polish government in exile, which, he claimed, was closely connected with the Germans and their agents in Poland were killing Soviet partisans. Rejecting this libel, Churchill reminded Stalin that England declared war because of Poland, at a time, he could have added, but did not, when Stalin was collaborating with Hitler. Knowing he had Roosevelt in his pocket, Stalin felt no need to humor Churchill, demanding that the United States and Britain give him a guarantee that the Polish government in exile would cease the killing of partisans in Poland and agree to sign off on the 1939 line between Poland and the Soviet Union. Backing up the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden demanded clarification. Was it the Molotov-Ribbentrop line that Stalin meant? Call it what you will, Stalin replied. We still consider it just and right. When Molotov repeated his canard that Soviets were only asking for the Curzon line of 1919 to 1920 to be restored, Eden whipped out a map to show everyone the differences. Here, at a critical moment in negotiations over the post-war borders of Eastern Europe, when a combined US-British stand might have salvaged something for Poland, Roosevelt intervened again on Stalin's side, asking whether an involuntary transfer of peoples from the mixed areas was possible, to help rearrange Poland's borders to Stalin's liking. Of course, Stalin replied dryly, such a transfer was entirely possible. Having encouraged Stalin to cleanse eastern Poland of Poles before annexing it, Roosevelt then changed the subject before Churchill and Eden could object to his astonishing sellout. The president was not ready to give up on his beloved China, in particular his plans to include it in the Big Four powers of what he now referred to as the United Nations, occupied France being then excluded from the club. The Allies, Roosevelt told Churchill, had a moral obligation to do something for China. No one knew when the Soviets would join the war against Japan. Suppose Marshal Stalin, the president told Churchill in a rare moment of clear thinking about the Soviet dictator, was unable to be as good as his word, we might find that we had forfeited Chinese support without obtaining commensurate help from the Russians. If Chiang did not get the promised Andaman operation to open up the Burma Road, the president warned, China might drop out of the war, freeing up 35 Japanese divisions, nearly 80% of the Japanese Imperial Army for operations elsewhere. Admiral King, who shared Roosevelt's view on China, promised that he could find landing craft elsewhere for Europe, enabling Buccaneer to go forward. For 4 days, Roosevelt remained stubborn as a mule on the Bay of Bengal operation. Then, he gave in. In part, this owed to the president's feeling that he needed to agree with Churchill on something after leaving him out to dry in Tehran and cruelly mocking him in Stalin's presence. The British just won't do the operation, he told the commander of American forces in China, General Joseph Warren Vinegar Joe Stilwell, who had just arrived in Cairo, referring to Buccaneer, and I can't get them to agree to it. To maintain appearances, Roosevelt thought that it won't do for a conference to end that way. Having agreed to cede Eastern Europe to Soviet domination at Tehran, Roosevelt now agreed to sell out China at Cairo. The president sent off a terse wire to Chiang Kai-shek in Chongqing, informing the Generalissimo that Buccaneer is off. Churchill had suggested fudging the rejection by claiming that Buccaneer was postponed until after the monsoon. Roosevelt, to his credit, thought Chiang deserved the truth. Chiang accepted the news gracefully, asking in return that the Americans ship him more warplanes and the financial aid he had requested, in gold. It was the last gasp of a dying cause. Lend-Lease deliveries to China, already a tiny fraction of those allotted to Britain and Russia, only $126 million worth was sent to Chongqing during all of 1941 and 1942, or 1.5% of the global total were reduced in 1943 and 1944 to a mere 0.4% of Lend-Lease spending. Although Churchill's opposition to Buccaneer had pressured Roosevelt into withdrawing his commitment to China, Stalin's spies in the U.S. camp, in particular Solomon Adler, the treasury man in Chongqing, had been poisoning the well against Chiang for months. Like Churchill on the Chetniks in Yugoslavia, Roosevelt began to doubt whether Chiang was really the right man to back in China. Chiang would have us believe, he told his son Elliot after speaking with Stilwell in Cairo, that the Chinese communists are doing nothing against the Japanese, we know differently. This was manifestly untrue. In October 1940, Stalin had brokered a secret deal in which Japan promised not to attack Mao's forces and vice versa. Ominously, Roosevelt began to talk after Cairo about withdrawing military aid from China unless Chiang democratized his regime by forming a unity government with the communists at Yenin. After returning to Washington from Cairo, Harry Dexter White slow-walked, diminished, and ultimately curtailed deliveries of the $200 million promised to China. When Secretary Morgenthau inquired why Chiang was not receiving the gold Roosevelt had promised him, Morgenthau was set straight by 3 Treasury advisors now known to have been Soviet agents, White, Adler, and Frank Coe, who told him Jiang's cronies would steal or squander the gold. This communist talking point about the irredeemably corrupt Chiang Kai-shek, crafted by 3 Soviet agents in the Treasury Department, was Washington conventional wisdom by the end of the war, and it remains a standard trope of the historical literature on China to this day. Terrible as the fate of Poland and Eastern Europe was, the most lasting consequence of Stalin's victories in 1945 was the impetus they had given to communist expansion in Asia, above all in China. It is true that Stalin agreed to recognize Jiang's nationalist government in the Sino-Soviet Agreement of August 14, 1945, and to give it formal political control over Manchuria, a deal initially seen by Mao and the Chinese communists as a betrayal. On August 20, Stalin even ordered Mao to avoid armed confrontations with Jiang's forces. Chiang was confident enough of Stalin's good faith that he invited Mao to Chongqing in September and coaxed a pledge out of him that the communists would stop the civil war and unite under the leadership of Chairman Chiang to build a modern China. With Jiang's government recognized by all the great powers and supported materially by the United States, it appeared that Stalin would have to settle for a sphere of influence in Manchuria, with a pro-American government south of it. Such, at any rate, was the hope of the Truman administration. With the stakes this high, Stalin was never likely to settle. We now know that Mao's pledge of unity with Chiang on September 18 was phony, because the day before he had received orders from Stalin to expand towards the north into Soviet-occupied Manchuria, orders Mao passed on to his armies after returning to Yan'an on September 19. His statement in Chongqing, Mao assured his generals, was a mere scrap of paper. On October 4, 1945, Stalin ordered Mao to move his forces from southern China into the north and Manchuria, promising that Red Army commanders would provide arms for 300,000 of Mao's men. The idea was to lure Jiang's forces north, against the now lavishly supplied Maoist army. It worked. Although Chiang's American advisors, including Vinegar Joe Stilwell's successor General Albert Wedemeyer, urged him to avoid the trap, in October 1945 Chiang moved his troops north and resumed the Chinese Civil War. Stalin now showed his true colors, closing all Manchurian ports to nationalist forces. As an added insult, the Vazht informed Chiang on October 17 that he would not share any captured Japanese war material with the Chinese government and that he would not be withdrawing Soviet troops from Chinese territory 3 months after the war as he had pledged to do in the Sino-Soviet Agreement of August. The Soviet occupation of Manchuria lasted until April 1946, which gave Stalin's armies more than enough time to cart off nearly $2 billion worth of war booty, leaving one of Asia's key industrial areas in ruins, and to make sure that, by the time the Red Army left, Mao's armies were firmly in control. Stalin thus ensured that Manchuria, the richest region in China, would be controlled not by the Chinese national government that had fought for it ever since Japan invaded in 1931, but by a friendly communist regime, that of Mao, whose men had not fought there, or anywhere else in China against Japanese forces, for that matter, and should therefore have had no claim on it. Had the US government been as devoted to Chiang's cause as Stalin was to Mao's, the loss of Manchuria would not necessarily have been fatal to the Kuomintang. But the Truman administration, despite being less woolly-minded about Stalin than Roosevelt's had been, was snowed under in China just the same. In a pattern similar to the British betrayal of Mihailovich in Yugoslavia, U.S. aid to Chongqing was made conditional on Chiang inviting Mao into his government, notwithstanding the fact that the two men were fighting a civil war over China's future. On September 15, 1945, when Mao was in Chongqing pretending to play nice, the U.S. government instructed Wedemeyer to inform Chiang that military assistance furnished by the United States would not be diverted for use in fratricidal warfare or to support undemocratic administration. On November 10, a Joint Chiefs of Staff directive stipulated that American military aid to China will cease immediately if evidence compels the U.S. government to believe that Chinese troops, receiving such aid, are using it to conduct civil war. In this vein, Truman sent General Marshall to Chongqing in December 1945 to broker a coalition government between Chiang and Mao, two mortal political enemies whose civil war had just resumed. Marshall even sent American officers to Kalgan, the Great Wall gateway city Stalin had handed over to Mao, to train Mao's Chinese communist soldiers. On Marshall's watch, U.S. financial aid to Chongqing was slow-walked and arms shipments kept to a trickle and then cut off entirely in September 1946. By 1947, the proxy conflict in China was wholly one-sided, with Stalin providing Mao with whatever he needed, including new Soviet tanks and artillery, and the United States leaving Chiang to his own devices and forbidding him to use American arms against Mao's communists. In view of the U.S. cutoff of Chongqing in 1946 and Mao's ever-increasing arms intake from the Soviet Union by way of communized Manchuria, the mystery is not that Mao won the Chinese Civil War but that it took him 3 more years to do so. There is grim irony in the timing of the final U.S. betrayal of Chiang, which coincided with the belated awakening of the United States and Britain to the communist threat in Europe. The Rape and Plunder of Germany, page 623. Still, exploiting slave labor was old hat to Stalin. What he really wanted from Germany was its industrial wealth, factories, patents, engineers, and their manufacturing know-how. At Yalta, Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed to a Soviet reparations bill of $10 billion to be levied on Germany in cash, kind, and labor. Having already looted the Reichsbank of cash and acquired nearly 2 million German slave laborers, Stalin would now claim his share of German commercial and industrial property. A crude monetary estimate of the industrial equipment stripped from German factories and shipped to the USSR in the first 18 months after V-Day was 10.369 billion Reichsmarks, $4.12 billion, nearly $500 billion in current equivalent. Overseeing this, the greatest organized looting operation in history, was a kind of war booty army inside the Red Army, which had begun operating as early as January 1943, when Stalin created the first 15 looting battalions, each 500 strong, and 2,500 strong looting brigades composed of 5 battalions each. In April 1943, these had been subordinated to the State Ministry of Defense, which oversaw 6 looting battalions, with a total strength of 15,000, and 39 independent looting battalions, numbering 19,500 actives. By 1945, these Red Army looting units were assigned 5 entire trains devoted exclusively to carrying loot back home, along with several dozen heavy tractors, tugboats, and an array of cranes, many of them given by American Lend-Lease. They were also assigned, beginning in February 1945, 80,000 men, divided into forced labor battalions of 500 men, along with lend-lease, cars and trucks. To help with more delicate extractions of specialized equipment, chemicals and sensitive material, and blueprints and intellectual property, after V-Day the looting battalions were reinforced with 432 Soviet engineers, 184 technicians, 206 master builders, and 1,092 skilled workers. Small wonder Stalin's looting battalions were able to cart off from Germany alone, by the end of 1946, 4.15 million tons of industrial, commercial, artistic, and intellectual property, and 519,000 railway wagons, an operation that would ultimately net Stalin 9.991 million tons of industrial goods. Taking no chances, Stalin ordered his looters to front-load shipments as much as humanly possible in case the Western Allies cried foul. By August 2, 1945, less than 2 months after V-Day, nearly half of the total volume of loot, 4.68 million tons, had already crossed the Soviet border. A list of the items shipped by rail and road from Germany to Russia after 1945 bears a curious resemblance to the Lend-Lease goods shipped to Russia between 1941 and 1945, except that, for the German goods, the Russians had to pay for the shipping the Americans had provided free of charge. Stalin laid claim to many of the same industrial inputs, for example, finished steel products, especially rails and rolling stock, 260,024 tons, and non-ferrous metals, 49,600 tons, including aluminum and zinc. German property looted by Stalin included, by November 1946, 3,024 entire factories, 1,323 locomotive engines, 20,432 types of lifting equipment, including 5,500 industrial cranes, 394,754 machine tools, 4,667 foundries, telephone switchboards, cables, and wire, steel smelting Bessemer plants, Siemens Martin design, coking plants, diesel engines and generators, electric motors and generators, furnaces and hydroturbines, chemical and textile factories, printing works, and passenger cars. The Germans were not the only ones being looted. Stalin's men also carted off 211,500 railway wagons worth of booty from Poland, that is, not counting the parts of Poland annexed by the USSR, 31,200 from Austria, 2,800 from Hungary, and 6,500 from Czechoslovakia. Just as in Germany, this loot included everything from iron and steel, 610,000 tons, to non-ferrous metals, 200,000 tons, to cranes, motors, pumps, engines, generators, turbines and locomotive engines, telephone equipment, 354 telephone switching stations with 456,300 telephone connections, woodworking facilities, and even paper, 10,100 tons. If we include non-German countries, the Soviet intake of war booty totaled, by the end of 1947, the equipment, inventory, intellectual property, and records of 1.2 million separate factories or enterprises, including Siemens, BMW, and Allianz Insurance. In this way, Bogdan Musial argues in a brilliant 2011 book, it was the plundering of Germany and the other countries Stalin conquered in 1945 that helped turn the impoverished and inconsistently industrialized USSR into a superpower. What most Germans remember about the Russian conquest of 1945, however, were the rapes, fueled not merely by pent-up rage and lust for revenge among soldiers who had seen their country invaded and brutalized, but by galloping drunkenness. In almost every village from the Baltic to the Alps, daughters and mothers and grandmothers were sexually assaulted and then beaten, stabbed, killed, or left for dead. Younger German women may have suffered the worst, as many of them were raped by dozens of soldiers before finally being discarded. One Soviet officer met a girl who had been raped as many as 250 times. But as a Soviet army major confessed to a British journalist, Red Army men were by 1945 so sex-starved that they often raped women of 60, 70, or even 80, much to these grandmothers' surprise. Numerous eyewitness reports backed up this claim, with the Vatican representative in Germany, Monsignor G.B. Montini, adding that elderly nuns were raped in the middle of Berlin wearing their religious habits. As another Berliner recalled, almost no evening went by, no night, in which we did not hear the pitiful cries for help from women who were attacked on the streets or in the always open houses. One Red tank gunner boasted, citing a figure close to current historians' estimates on the number of Germans raped by Soviet troops after the war, that 2 million of our children were born in Germany. As Solzhenitsyn later recalled, all of us knew very well that if the girls were German they could be raped and then shot. This was almost a combat distinction. This kind of thinking was consistent with the indiscriminate logic of retribution, of atrocity and counter-atrocity, that had defined the bloodlands ever since Stalin's pact with Hitler had erased the borders of Eastern Europe in September 1939. It reached its culmination in the expulsion of over 6 million ethnic Germans, most of them women, children, and elderly men, from their homes in areas of Prussia absorbed into Western Poland to accommodate Stalin's annexation of Eastern Poland, followed by another more than 6 million German speakers expelled from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia. At least 500,000, and possibly as many as 1.5 million, civilians perished in this forgotten mass deportation. The Soviet mass rapes, civilian murders, and deportations of 1945 were significant not because they were unique, but because they were a harbinger of what lay in store for anyone liberated by the Red Army. Eastern Europe had been Sovietized. Next it would be Asia's turn. Treasonous Lend-Lease, page 634. Had a principled and patriotic American statesman listened to this threat, he would have put Stalin in his place regarding the Soviet Union's apparently abject dependence on gifted American war material to equip its armies. Instead, Hopkins apologized and refused to back up Truman's decision to curtail Lend-Lease shipments to Europe after Nazi Germany had ceased to exist, a decision, Hopkins said sheepishly, and inaccurately, that resulted from a technical misunderstanding. Lend-Lease shipments to Vladivostok, to enable Stalin's armed conquest of the northern Asian mainland, would, Hopkins reassured the Vazht, be carried out to the end. This was no exaggeration. In hearings before the House Appropriations Committee on June 13, the man Hopkins had appointed to oversee the Soviet program, General C.M. Wesson, informed Congress that, although the Soviet Union has not declared war against Japan, Lend-Lease aid is being continued to the Soviet Union. On the principle of furnishing supplies and services necessary to support programs of essential Soviet military requirements in the Far East. This included the completion of the Fourth Protocol commitment through June 30, 1945, along with a special list submitted to General Dean in Moscow in October 1944 specifying material requirements for equipping a Soviet force of 1.5 million men with supplies, food, fuel, and transport equipment sufficient for 2 months, along with 2 million pairs of boots. In the end, only 80% of these special requirements had been fulfilled by June 30, 1945, although one expects that Soviet disappointment might have been leavened by the arrival, by that same date, of 2.7 million tons of war material that had come to Vladivostok during the Fourth Protocol period before May 12, 1945, and the 1.35 million more tons that reached the Soviet Far East between that date and September 2. If we aggregate regular protocol and special Lend-Lease allotments for the Asian theater, over the last 14 months of the Pacific War the Soviets received more than 4 million long, metric, tons of war material for Stalin's Far Eastern armies, including 870,000 long tons of petroleum. So voluminous were American Lend-Lease shipments across the Pacific to the Soviet Far East in this period, during the climactic phase of the war against Japan, that they equaled the volume shipped across the North Atlantic during the entire war to support the Red Army against the Wehrmacht, rounding out a total shipped across the Pacific of 8.244 million tons, which did not even include the warplanes flown into Siberia via Alsib along with the sensitive and often strategic cargo they contained.